Okay, great. Well, hello everyone. My name is Thanos Patelis, and I'll be facilitating this session entitled "The Struggle is Real: Tracking Alignment Challenges in a Changing Assessment World." So welcome everybody. First, I want to thank Susan Davis Becker, partner with ACS Ventures, for organizing this session and all her efforts to put a cohesive session together. Now, the way that this session is organized is around 5 challenges associated with alignment. The way we've worked it out is that one of the session panelists will provide an introduction to the issue. Then each panelist will offer some comments, followed by input from you all, the participants. When you're offering your comments, please, or questions, after each topic, we will please send them via chat, and I will moderate the questions or comments that you have. So please send them via the chat, and I'll make sure to monitor and voice those out. Now, in addition to Susan Davis Becker, who's a partner with ACS Ventures, we are thrilled to have Wayne Camara, Horace Mann Chair at ACT Inc., Ellen Fort, CEO and Chief Scientist at EdCount, and Scott Marion, Executive Director of the Center for Assessment. So I'm going to turn to our first topic, defining the purpose and scope/components of the alignment evaluation. And Ellen Fort will offer an introduction, followed by commentary from each of the panels. So,
good morning. Can you hear me? I'll let Thanos be the interpreter. Great, thank you. Good morning and welcome. If this is your first virtual NCMU conference session, then welcome to the new format, new world. So my job in this couple of minutes here is just to take you through an overview of my perspective on what the scope is for an alignment study. And then you'll see each of the topics will work out in this way. As Thanos said, we'll have a little conversation. So Thanos, are you in charge of the slides? Are you running the slides for us? Okay, if you want to go ahead and just go to the next one. Here is a framework that if you've read my work or heard me present in the past decade, you've probably seen a couple times. So I have this framework to present, to illustrate rather, the notion that all of these things are really connected. That at the end of the day, we take very seriously the understanding of validity as having to do with the interpretation and use of test scores. So if you go up to what would be that circle in the upper left-hand or right-hand corner, excuse me, of the, where it says scores of the framework, you're seeing that that's where we're trying to get. We're trying to support the meaning of test scores. So to do that in a test that's supposed to be standards-based, we start way over there on the left with a whole set of standards, which is represented in this framework by all those squares. And we have to have some way of inducing the notions that we're going to tap into. This is the same process that you would use if you were building curricula, same process. So we have to, what are the big ideas there? So the C's would be the claims, and the T's in this particular representation would be the measurement targets. So we identify the things we want to be able to say about what students know and can do in relation to the standards. So I do want to make that distinction here. It's important to understand with testing that there's nothing in US education policy, in the legislation, or anything else that says you're supposed to measure all the standards. Nowhere does it say that, and that's a silly thing to even try to do. So instead, we want to create some claims, and you'll see that I'm very much focused in a principle design framework myself. So we induce the claims, and then we move into the process of building using, again, a principle design approach, performance standards, blueprints, and all the pieces you're going to need to create to elicit the observations that you want, that will give you the evidence you need to make interpretations of students' knowledge and skills back to those standards. So we build those pieces, we continue to move along in terms of building our test forms and our measurement model. And by the time we get to actually administering this to a student, we've done a whole lot of work. And so those of you who have been involved in test design and development understand that there's a lot that what's administered is a tip of the iceberg. So in terms of alignment, that means we really need to evaluate all of these transition points. How did we get to our claims and measurement targets? How do we develop our performance standards, including our PLDs? How do we develop our blueprints? How do we develop these things that will eventually allow us to interpret scores back in relation to those standards? So from my perspective, alignment evaluation should look at all of these things, not just the items that happen to appear on a test form. A test form, a collection of items on which a score is based, is one possible representation. So we have to have some ways to know that that particular sample that we're seeing represents, well, all possible samples of test forms. So we're making some decisions about the quality of the blueprint, the quality of the task models and item templates or test specifications. Primarily, when we do an alignment evaluation, we have to involve independent people coming in to also make some decisions. So I'm going to have you go to the next slide. We can certainly always come back to this one, but we're really asking two essential questions here. How is a test designed and developed to yield scores that can be interpreted in relation to content and performance expectations? And how well did you do that? So we look at the actual items or a sample of items that appear in a form. If we're talking about an adaptive test, then we need to look at multiple collections of items that actual students saw. And I would say students who scored at the lower end, somewhere in the middle, and somewhere at the high end of the scale, or would if we're looking at the items ahead of time. So we need to see those pathways. So the same rules apply whether you're talking about a fixed form or an adaptive test. And so we look at an independent evaluation. Now, we each get just a few minutes here. I will just briefly, we can show you the next slide, but I'm not going to speak to it, but I'll let you know that it's here if we want to come back to it. So Thanos, you just want to go to that next slide because that comes up. What's independent mean? Because you do need to have other people come in there. So we will just maybe leave that up or go back to the framework slide, I guess, and start our conversation with the panel.
Okay, Wayne, would you like to offer some
The only remark I'll make about Ellen's, and I agree with most of what she says, I think she has a very good framework for talking about alignment, is that the comment she made at the beginning, which is that standards do not necessarily have to reflect all learning, all content, and certainly the assessment often cannot reflect all learning. And so I find it helpful when, and many states do this, not all, but many states have measurable content. So they may have standards that are quite comprehensive in mathematics or writing or ELA or science. And then they go a little bit further and they denote those standards which are measurable or accessible content. Because if you're building a test and you look at standards comprehensively and you try to measure them all, many of them, such as like research skills, do not align very well to even performance tests, quite frankly. They require a unique, innovative type of assessment. So I think that's something we need to address a little bit more clearly when we talk about alignment. Some states address it right off the bat and differentiate between their standards and what can be measurable. Other states make that relationship implied and it's not quite overt, and it's tougher to really defend alignment studies. So that's one observation I wanted to throw out there.
So I'll jump in next. This is Scott Marion, folks. So Ellen, I agree with you completely that you know, a test can't measure all the standards, especially given the complexity and the breadth of things like the Common Core and the NGSS. We have a harder time convincing our friends at the U.S. Department of Education of that. So nobody has any qualms when we say the English language arts standards includes things like speaking and listening, and it's very hard to do that on a state summative test, so they're okay with that. But when you say, you know, we think that we want you to teach all 10 of these standards, but we're going to assess 7, and we're going to say that these are the 7 on the assessment. Unless you have the kind of rationales like, you know, doing an extended research project like Wayne just talked about, or the speaking and listening standards, I found it much more difficult to use this approach with the U.S. Department of Ed. Do you want to speak to that at all, talking about accessible standards versus all learning standards?
Sure. I think that's a very important piece. And I will say we've applied this framework for almost 10 years and never had a single problem in peer review. The notion there is, you go to the far left here and you think if you're moving from your standards to claim, a small set of claims, you're not sloughing off your standards. You're not prioritizing and just picking standards. I think you're actually reflecting the way we should be teaching is inducing the bigger ideas that are based on the standards. So you're not losing any standards necessarily. And so I think that we've done a disservice to our educators to say that you need to treat your standards like a checklist and you have to do each one and not think any beyond that. That's not how they're taught, and that shouldn't be. If we're thinking about what is the nature of the observation I need to see to be able to make an inference about the student's knowledge and skills, it's at the claims level. So it's a smaller number, a handful, I would say 5 to 7 things, magic numbers, that we can hope to get through in a course or a school year and on a test. And so there certainly are things that you've mentioned a few examples, speaking and listening, the research, those kinds of things that are quite challenging to do in a large scale assessment setting. And I do think in the years to come, we'll be seeing more and more creative performance-based kinds of assessments that are more closer, more proximal to instruction. But I want to make it clear that there are some standards that not all standards are created equal. And I think that in the notion back in the day when states were being pressed to adopt the Common Core, and I think the Common Core is pretty good, but then to allow themselves 15% or something of their own standards, I've never understood that. Treating them as a number by weight, by the number of words in them. But if you just seriously look at a set of standards and you realize that there's a bit of a hierarchy in there already, and that you induce those claims through a series of conversations with your educators, and that's how you get to that point. So that's gonna articulate better in terms of where you go within curriculum and where you go within assessment. And in fact, that should be exactly the same conversation that you're having.
And I'll just want to jump in and add that I think this framework is a great illustration, and some of the comments that have already come up are great examples of how we're showing that, one model does not fit all, one alignment process, or this isn't very specific. So I like this framework in that it encourages folks to, like you said, take that step back and think about what is it you really want to say with your results. And think about the specific situation you're in, because every subject in every state could be different. And as assessments evolve, they're going to be different. So thanks for sharing.
Science. Mm-hmm. Science, please stop thinking that you're going to assess all the state. I mean, that's the only way to do science is to identify a handful, and I mean a single digit of PEs, the intersections of there's the only way to do that. So that's one of those great examples of where you are forced to do something in a very different way. And now let's start doing that same kind of thing for the other content areas.
But that means really being careful about what you're claiming, right?
Yes.
In terms of the generalizability of those claims.
That's why your first phase of your principled assessment design process, the unpacking and the clearly defining your observations, your intended observations is so important. So.
Yeah.
And it should allow us to reconsider what we were doing in many states before NCLB, which is some kind of a sampling, where I know one state I worked with for a number of years, Scott, you and I both worked for Pennsylvania way back when, and a model that they had before NCLB, which was very attractive to me, was that they had about 3/4 of the content, maybe 2/3 of the content, assessing at the individual level, and about 1/3 of the content assessing at the group level, classroom level, which allowed you to cover more standards broadly at the classroom level, fewer standards deeper at the individual level. And that fell out of favor with accountability, but that kind of seems like a model that should at least be available for states to choose from, because it has some advantages.
Yeah, for sure. And I just put a note in the chat. Folks, feel free to add questions to the chat and we'll try to get to them.
And just to kind of round that out, I agree with the strategy of sampling. We see that a lot in credentialing assessments, because if you kind of define the world and scope of a particular profession or role within a profession, it's huge. And there's no way you can measure everything on one test. And so therefore it's assume that there will be some type of sampling strategy applied to appropriately represent everything in there. And that, you know, one year it may look different than the next, one form may look different than the next, but it's still all following the same sampling plan. All right.
Do folks from participants have any questions, comments that you'd like to offer? Please do so on the Zoom group chat function. Or if you're having difficulty with that, raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask your
There's a question here from the great Lori Wise. Nice to see him joining this session. So do you need to consider how coverage is accomplished over time? Ellen, you want to, in terms of your sampling and how states are going to do that, it can do it by time, but I'll let you respond to this.
Yeah, part of what we look at when we're sifting through all the documents is I don't want to just see the standards and the test forms. I want to see the blueprints. I want to see the documentation about how the decisions were made about how you sample. Every single test is a sample. Every item on a test is a sample. So you have to be clear in how you're doing that. A blueprint plays a role in that, but you can have a rolling blueprint. I think we're going to see more and more matrix sampling. So there are variations between what a individual student takes and what students in a group take. You can make inferences about groups and individuals, even if they don't take all the items. But if you want to have something that rolls, that you're going to have some emphases that change or to be, I guess, more of a surprise to what's on the test, if you should have a plan that should be written down. Then I can see that and say that people who know what they're talking about got together and made a decision about how you're going to sample over the course of 3 years, for example. And that's perfectly acceptable. It has to be written down. It has to be reviewed and evaluated. But if the right people are a part of that, it's the same kind of process you would make at the claims. If you say we can't get to all these things in one test, that's reasonable. A large-scale test is but a small thing, as large as it feels to some people. It's a one snapshot. So yes, as long as you have a plan for how you do that and you cover, that's perfectly acceptable.
Now, there are a couple of questions that came up. One I'd like to, because it seems to be a follow-up to that, so I'm going to present this question first. So what's the relationship between the standard and the purpose of the test? And the question is, so you are saying that the standard only applies to what the purpose/use of the test is, which obviously could limit your claims. So it's how do we accommodate the relationship between what the test is measuring and what the standard is?
I'm not sure I'm really understanding that question. So I don't know that I understand that question. If someone else can.
Well, this is Wayne. I'll speculate a little bit, and I may get the question wrong myself. So I'm thinking of an example of a claim that a test and standards are geared to college readiness for high school, because that's my modus operandi. So that's an easy example for me to think of. If one were to say that we're going to measure college and career readiness standards for a high school test, for high school standards, I think it's possible, if you begin with instruction, to identify a large group of standards that are required for mathematics, for example, or science, and to denote some of them are more critical for college success and others are less, or maybe not even essential at all. And then the determination is, do you build your blueprint to acknowledge that there are 15 math standards or strands, but you're only going to assess 8 of the 15 because they're most relevant for college success? I think that's acceptable. Or you could also say, we've got 15 standards in math. We're going to assess 1 through 10 this year, 5 through 15 next year, and 1 through 4 and 13 through 15 year 3. So you could do it either way. But I think if you're specifying that the purpose of your test is for a particular use, like college readiness, and there can be other uses, but if that's the purpose, that should drive the assessment. And you can have more standards. I think it's fine to have more standards that are outside that boundary, but I think it's also fine to prioritize the standards that are geared to the intended use of the score interpretation.
Yeah, I think there's I would just say that there's the notion of standards, a number of items for a standard. there should never be an attempt on a test to pick a number of items that go with the standard. There's no rule about that. There's some need to have some reliability around a score. So you have to have enough measurement weight to just be able to say something if you're going to report a score. But the idea of a score for a standard doesn't make any sense to me. A notion of basing everything on standards without moving through the claims process or the big ideas process will send people in the wrong direction, whether they're developing tests or curricula. So standards are not a checklist. They are an uneven and bumpy set of stuff that you need to induce big ideas from. I think we're probably ready for our second topic.
Yeah. Just keep
But
track
yes,
of
we'll
the
move
time.
on to the second topic. Thank you. Introductory comments for the second topic will be Wayne Camara.
Okay, and you can go to the next slide, Thanos. And of course, I renumbered. I've got my numbering wrong, and this is really topic 2, even though my slide says topic 3. Determining the classes of evidence used for evaluating alignment. Well, I won't go into the first part too comprehensively. We know that the 4 areas that Norm Webb and others have agreed on that really make sense for looking at alignment includes content, depth of knowledge, range of knowledge, and balance of knowledge, the weighting. And I think those are 4 good areas to focus on. I think primarily we overemphasize 2 of them. We emphasize the content match and the depth of knowledge, but I think all 4 of them are important. The one thing I want to hop on is when I think of alignment from an accountability perspective versus test standards, and having Laurie Weiss here, it'd be interested to see his take on this. I think I do difference to the standards, and what I feel is that we've placed so much weight on alignment as though it is a 6th source of validity, which it's not. Alignment is one facet, one mechanism of establishing content validity. I think you can establish content validity, quite frankly, without an alignment. A word processing test, job analysis. I can look at the computer layout on the keyboard that's used at the office. I can look at the equipment that's used at the office. And if I'm measuring spent and agility and speed and errors, I can do that without a job analysis if you tell me that skill is required on the job and essential for function. I don't need an alignment. I don't need to know the cognitive depth. I don't need to know that we're typing words that are an average of 6 characters long in the test versus 4 characters long in the actual job. Those things kind of even out. And so I think we've placed way too much emphasis on accountability. And so I do believe that the accountability movement has led us astray in that regard. This graphic I've got here is something we always talk about quite a bit in terms of assessment. And I think the circles, while they overlap, we don't always pay equal attention to them. So the content standards, many would say, should articulate the kind of instruction that we want to see in the classroom. What's being taught, how's it being taught, what processes are being taught. And there should be alignment between the instruction and the content standards. Whether we begin with the content standards and determine instruction follows it, or whether we begin by surveying instructors and find out to develop our content from what's being taught, there should be an overlap. And then finally, if you've got standards, alignment talks about the alignment between the test items and the standards themselves. What I feel is that, again, Ellen began by talking about the claims, the big ideas. How's the test going to be used? And I feel that there's, quite frankly, alignment methods. Well, they're not alignment, quite frankly. The standards movement has totally taken a bath on linking the content standards to the purpose. So we've got all these state tests, and I'm on many state TACs, and I've been involved with others who talk about linking their state tests to college readiness. And what they do is where they get 10, 12 educators together, tell us what's college ready in geometry. Well, guess what? Many people don't need any geometry in college. Tell us what's college ready in algebra. Again, many people don't need any algebra or calculus. And so the idea that experts are where the sun rises and sets in terms of content standards, I think is a false narrative. And I think the big problem with the alignment is not the alignment, it is the content standards that no one has bothered to validate, that when we say that these standards reflect college readiness, that they reflect rigor, that they reflect what is being taught, no one's bothered to establish that kind of evidence. I'm all for content evidence, but I believe some statistical evidence should be collaborating what we find in content. So that's my big concern there. The relationship between instructions and standards are often ignored, I think. Next slide. I'm going to end with this one, Thanos. Can we skip one more? I'm going to follow what Ellen did. I'll leave that one up at the end for folks to look at. So determining the classes of evidence, what I'm really focusing on here is not the evidence that we bring to alignment, but the evidence we use to evaluate an alignment. So when a vendor or when a state does an alignment analysis of a test, how do we evaluate whether that alignment is rigorous and fair and valid? How do we evaluate the alignment? And I believe that evidence is needed to evaluate the quality of the alignment study, not evidence brought forth to do an alignment, but once the alignment is done, how do we evaluate it? Because as has been said several times in the literature and elsewhere, we often find 3 different alignment studies with 3 different results for the same standards and the same test. So first of all, alignment is totally judgmental, which I have a little bit of a problem with, as you can imagine, based on all evidence and the quality of whether a test is being used by a state appropriately or inappropriately based on judgmental processes, I think is a serious flaw. Standard setting is a judgmental process, job analysis is a judgmental process, but we have better metrics to evaluate them than we do standard setting. We place all the emphasis on the qualification of the panelists. Are they qualified? Do they represent diverse expertise? Is there a small number? Well, that's where we begin the evaluation, not end it. We need internal evidence, and I see this missing all the time. What is the reliability or consistent of ratings? Which that evidence is often omitted. I am not a fan of consensus processes because consensus processes undermine reliability. If we have panelists who have different ratings and they have some bias, halo effects, leniency effects, and we do a consensus process, if we do it well with the right facilitator, we're going to find we come out to the same perspective. Well, how about if you really think that that's truth, do it again. If you really think that those 10 math panelists came up with the exact truth, do it a second time with a second independent body of panelists. You won't find the same results. So the lack of any reliability or consistency of ratings is a major weakness of alignment. The external evidence, the lack of replicability, the lack of iterative processes or multiple panels. The next slide when we get to it talks about job analysis. Often there's no way to identify a biased panelist because we lean on the consensus process at the end. There's no metric or criteria to determine when items are aligned. The same item can be aligned to multiple standards. Depth of knowledge or cognitive demand can differ. And finally, the lack of data demonstrating students are proficient meet the standards. So if you tell me that these standards, that this behavior represents a student who's proficient, give me proof. Give me some students who we agree are proficient in college or in the subsequent grade, and show me that they lack this, they have the skill to answer those standards, or those standards they've missed, they lack the ability to answer them. So we need some data to compound this. And I think I'm really a critic, not so much of the alignment process, but of the fact that alignment is based on standards, which are not really evaluated. The last slide. What this slide does, and I'm not going to really go into it, it contrasts job analysis a little bit with alignment. Job analysis, I think, is very similar to alignment, but the difference is we begin with a list of tasks or knowledge, skills, and abilities, and we go to a panel of incumbents and we ask them to add to them, to evaluate them. And then we get results. Then we go to another city, another state, another group of incumbents, and we ask them to do the same thing. So if you really believe that alignment and quite frankly, standards development can hold up to rigor, do it repeatedly, do it iteratively, do it with different panels. You want to use a consensus process, that's fine, but you need to have replicability and reliability. And so these are just the positions that contrast how a job analysis, which is not perfect by any means, has data and can be evaluated a lot easier than alignment and content standards.
So open to some panelists. So Ellen, if you'd like to go next. Okay.
Sure, thanks. I greatly appreciate, Wayne, your comments. I think there are many critical issues with the way we look at alignment evaluation. And I want to say alignment evaluation is and should be primarily a qualitative process, that it is a formative evaluation process. The primary purpose of doing an alignment evaluation should be to inform the test designers, the developers, the clients, the states, about where in their system there may be places to improve in terms of their how they do their item specifications. They may have some idea that they're getting items that measure one thing when they're because their vendor told them that was, and they're really off base. They don't have the same underlying definition of what that claim meant. For example, we've certainly seen people who have tremendous expertise, subject matter expertise, have very different perspectives on what the same standard means. So you absolutely get a lot of disagreement that's legitimate. It's not one's right, one's wrong. There are different ways to interpret the standards. And what we want to do is have that conversation about, what do you mean by this? And have that same understanding conveyed as you move into curriculum and as you move into the testing. So the key points I want to make there are just that the alignment evaluation should be primarily formative evaluation. It is not a stamp of approval. Tests are not something that we can, be done with. It's part of a validity evaluation, validity evidence package. And I believe that we are making a mistake when we rush to the quantitative purposes, scores coming out of the evaluation, that you're trying to dance on the head of a pin there, that we have words, standards, language, interpretations. It requires qualitative information that can be used by a state to improve the quality of its system.
I would agree with that, Ellen, but it's not being used just that way, unfortunately. And so if you're going to use it for accountability and to tell a state that they need to add items to that test, they need to add performance tasks, they need to add level 3, level 4 DKO items to that test in order to get federal funding, at that level, you're using the alignment, you're misusing the alignment. I would certainly jump on your bandwagon of how alignment should be done, but since it's not being done that way, I'm going to raise a flag and say, where's your reliability, where's your replicability, where's your evidence?
I agree with what Wayne presented in the sense of, we have to think about the people in the room and what their perspectives are. And I appreciate the comparison to job analysis. As someone who's done a bunch of job analyses and a bunch of alignment studies, I see some of the similar things where the perspectives do play a role. Ellen made the point of sometimes educators, even in the same state with standards that have been in place for a while, still interpret them differently. And you can see those conversations come out a little bit. And that's why I actually do like the consensus process, because you can see those differences evolve through a discussion. And you're right, that does not mean it represents like 10 of 10 perspectives, but trying to capture that, I think, is important and make sure folks understand it. So I like where this is going in terms of thinking about how do we better represent the quality of what we're getting out of these studies.
Scott?
Yeah, go ahead, Dennis.
Go ahead, Scott. I'm just pointing to you for some comments.
So Wayne's throwing standards-based education under the bus, and it's okay. There's a lot of problems with it. I do think the development of standards is certainly has become a very politically driven process, and perhaps curriculum adoption has been for a long time. You look at state boards of education in certain states, so we're not getting the values judgments out of it about what kids should learn and things like that. I do hope that there are ways to improve the process, and I'm not necessarily shilling for the Common Core NGSS, but they did involve a lot of people and a lot of iterations going through. But I agree with you. There's still there's a ton of problems with the creation of standards. I am surprised that you're feeling better about standard setting, that's just setting cut scores, than you are about alignment, because if that's your saving grace, you're making me really nervous, because I've been in a lot of standard setting meetings that I think you have the same issues in both alignment studies and alignment panels and ways of establishing metrics of agreement or consensus processes like Susan does. Like I joke, I've been to, honest to God, I've been to sausage factories, I've watched legislation being made, and I've seen standards being set, and sausage was the cleanest of the three by far. So I don't know that I feel so I think alignment, I don't think is any worse than standard setting. I'm not sure it's any better, but there are ways of capturing the criteria.
Yeah, and I don't mean to hold up most standard setting as an example of best practice, but standard setting took it on the chin a few years ago. Bob Lynn published a paper and others have so, which showed state rankings in terms of their own standards versus NAEP. And so in Alabama, it ranks first in the nation on the number and percent of students who are proficient, but they rank like 39th in terms of NAEP results. They could do that. They could do that kind of, and Massachusetts, which were ranked first or second in terms of NAEP, but ranked like 8th or 9th in terms of how they did it themselves. It had a validity check. And so the data provided a validity check. We're not perfect. There are lots of reasons why there could be discrepancies, but I think it bounded and showcased the lack of synergy between standard setting across states, and I think it improved practice a little bit. Now impact data is being used. A lot of states I've worked with and others I haven't worked with bring in at least what does NAEP say, what does SAT say, what does ACT say, what is the percent of kids who go to college, and it's been used to triangulate some of the judgmental processes, which I don't see any of that happen in alignment. Well, not alignment again. I'm focusing on alignment, but where my real argument is the standards themselves.
So there's a good question in the chat here that I think it's, it's from Rob McCantifer. Given what you said, would you advise folks who write or revise state standards to write them differently? Are there things that could be done when these documents are revised to alleviate some of these issues? I'll just, since I read the question, I'll just offer one quick thing, then Wayne, I'll put it to you, is I think that we have to be clear about what things we want to have measured, and we would write those standards differently versus, learning standards, and it might be worth having, in some sense, two sets, because somebody's got to translate the standards into things like specifications, and if that's left to just the testing folks, you miss an opportunity. But Wayne, you should jump on that.
So an idea, and it's not fully baked, but an idea, which again I'll steal from IO psychology, is that if you're trying to define the math standards for successful college freshmen versus an advanced, a proficient, a basic, and a below basic college freshman, you can develop content standards, but then you go to the students themselves and you ask the students who are completed freshman year, graduated, completed freshman year with a grade of B or higher, and ask them what they know. Maybe even look at the test scores that they've amassed. Do they have proficiency in these areas that we're saying that you need to be proficient in? Do they not? The students who took entry-level calculus, pre-calculus, statistics, algebra, that kind of validity. So you can have 10 experts say, we need to, the reason I'm so critical of this is I see what high school teachers think students should master versus college professors think they should master. And there's a big discrepancy. But if you ask college professors how important this is, and the students themselves, and you validate it in terms of students who really possess those skills. So when we ask about successful students in mathematics, we're looking at kids who've taken a math course and passed it with a grade of B or higher, and then look back on them and validate whether the judgments are consistent with what we're thinking about. And there are methodological ways to do that. It takes a little bit more time, but it's not it's not impossible to do these kind of things. If they're as important as we're placing them in terms of educational curriculum, we can afford the time to do a validity check like that.
I add just on that I think that, because I really like that question about what we can do to make our standards better, or more. I think that what's missing in standards is they're not, often we think of content standards over here and performance standards like somewhere else. And to not look at those together is a big mistake, and to not consider them in an alignment study is a massive mistake, because that is how you're telling people how to interpret the scores. That is what you need to look at. So that I don't like DOK. I don't think anybody should be using it. I do think that when you develop items, you ought to be targeting 2 different performance levels. The problem is performance level descriptors are often very bad and don't have the kinds of information you need. So we need to improve those, yes. So I would say what is missing in standards in interpretation, in addition to what Wayne was saying, is that they are not combined with examples. You don't say, and this is what that looks like, and here's what it looks like at level 3 and at level 4. So you need to combine those ideas and make it real. And you can use test questions as examples. You can use artifacts. And in fact, most people do not have, I believe that alignment and standard setting are actually the same, parts of the same thing. And so if we have good PLDs and we can link items to those, we have part of our performance standards. You're supposed to have 5 pieces, right? You're supposed to have the levels, the names of the levels, the descriptors, the cut scores, and examples of student work. So we have to have student artifacts. We have to understand what that looks like in the classroom, and what does actually proficient look like when you're moving off, as Wayne was saying, into the real world, where we're supposed to be suggesting that students have some set of skills that are college and career ready. We have zero evidence that that's the case, really, in many situations. We just say we do. So I think we're missing the examples and the words and the illustrations to make these things come alive.
And in terms of standards-based education, I guess the question that really made me think a lot was recently, the folks in California, like Laurie, will be familiar with the UC Standardized Testing Task Force report that looked at SAT, ACT, and admissions. And one of the things they said about a consortium test that's been being pushed for admissions testing is they said there's absolutely no evidence that standards-based testing for summative testing is going to improve instruction or education. We've had this test here for 7 years. Every student, public school student in California has taken it. Scores have not increased at all in 7 years. So wouldn't scores increase if standards-based education were effective and we were teaching to the test and the tests were measuring the standards? Wouldn't we expect the scores to increase even a little bit? And the fact that they don't increase led them to conclude that there's no evidence that standards-based assessment is going to improve education. There's just a belief that it must be better than what we have now. And I think there's a requirement to show, if you're going to assert that we need certain types of tests or items because they improve education, they improve curriculum, I think you can show that the teachers are teaching to the test. I think you can also show that it doesn't matter at all.
All right.
Great comments.
Next topic.
Moving on to the next topic, aligning the alignments, and Scott will offer some comments.
So believe it or not, it looks like we're actually somewhat aligned and coordinated with a lot of our comments, although I don't want the take-home message to be that, Wayne said get rid of all standards and Ellen said get rid of all deep thinking, but so I'll try to bring up teasing. So go to the next slide, Thanos. So one of the things I want to talk about, some of the practical things that our state colleagues and our assessment vendor colleagues face on a regular basis. All state assessments are subject to the U.S. Department of Education's peer review as part of the standards and assessment regulations. And there are, Wayne is right, there is not a separate alignment standard as part of the joint standards, but there are alignment expectations in the peer review requirements. And they have this is the direct quote, and where they say suggested evidence more than suggested if you've actually been through it, report of results of an independent alignment study that is technically sound. Again, this is direct quote, i.e. methods and processes, appropriate units of analysis, clear criteria, and documents that documents adequate alignment, and then it gives some further specifications. Well, let's go to the next slide, Thanos. So independent, and I think it was Wayne or Ellen had a slide about independent, but the way it's often interpreted by the U.S. Department of Education and their peers is it means that the study was not conducted by the owner, the state, let's say, or the vendor. There was someone else. Technically sound, in this case, is a judgment made by the peer review team. And this is where I'm completely with Wayne on his concerns. How do they make this determination? And are there defined and agreed upon criteria for quality alignment studies? Folks like Ellen and others, Norm Webb and others have put out approaches for thinking about alignment, for how they conduct alignment studies, but I don't know if there's clear criteria in the field for evaluating the quality of alignment work. Let's go to the next slide. And so why this is a problem, I think, is that I've seen many examples of states or vendors getting noticeably different alignment results from their alignment studies without changing anything except the alignment contractor. So a state with a particular test doesn't pass or receives substantial feedback on its alignment, switches out an alignment vendor, and then now they pass. That's a concern. I think it's a credibility concern to alignment as a field and to the peer review process. And so, you know, the cynical side of me says, is this a case of getting the best results that money can buy, or are there legitimate reasons for these vastly different results? So there's clearly different methods at play. Alignment vendors, alignment contractors use different methods. As we know from standard setting, you know, to recycle Wayne's example, we know from standard setting, if you use different methods, if you use the Angoff versus the bookmark versus body work, you're going to get different results. Different alignment targets is something that I've seen play into this. And so these are just the, you know, the organization of the common core, right? You have standards at the finer grain, you have clusters at a little bit larger grain and domains at, you know, larger groups of related standards. You know, it could actually be ridiculous and say, yeah, is this item measure math? Yes, okay, it's aligned. I mean, that would be taking it to the logical extreme. I would add in here, Ellen's point about claims, which would probably be at a finer grain level than standards, or at least summarizing certain standards. You know, and are there different criteria? So Ellen talked about qualitative criteria for alignment results. We know that, and I see that Sarah Christensen's writing in the chat, but you know, Norm Webb proposed some quantitative metrics that I'm not sure were intended to be defined criteria as good enough or not, but they quickly got reified by peers and by the U.S. Department of Ed as, you know, unless your balance of representation was, you know, at a 0.5 or whatever the metrics would say, you would not pass. And so this is where I agree, and I saw that Lori Wise pushed back, but I'll push back and support Ellen on this, that this is where I think the formative notion is really important. And I'll tell you why I think that. And I am being a little cynical here about getting the best results that money could buy. And I have many friends in the alignment business, and I'm not saying this to disparage them. But if you think about it, you have 50 state clients in this business. If you're the vendor, your alignment contractor who continually fails states so that when they go forward with peer review, they can't pass, I bet you're not going to get hired much. It's really that simple. Now you should have, nobody's selling their soul, I promise. These people are all trustworthy. But this notion of this summative determination that is a make or break criteria with the U.S. Department of Education is a problem. What I've argued, and I've argued this with the U.S. Department, is they, in many cases, want an independent alignment study for every grade content area combination. And if you think that this is like $50,000 a pop, that adds up really fast. And why don't we just do it at a few grades and content areas? And if we argue we're using a defensible, hopefully principled assessment design process that applies across all grades, the alignment study would be treated like an audit. That's one way to lessen the burden. But better yet, you should show evidence that you incorporate an alignment study into your assessment design process, and you use the results formatively to improve your process, and you document that activity. I think would move us away from this pass-fail mark that we get with the feds. I could rant on, but I won't. Let's go to the next slide. And so these are more questions from my colleagues to get them juiced up a little bit. And so are we okay with letting any approach fly as long as the peers deem it technically sound? And you think about validity and reliability contextualized within use. People say, how reliable does a test have to be? You say, well, what are you doing with it? Right? If it's a high stakes graduation exam, it better be really damn reliable. If it's a daily formative assessment, the answer is no. And so is alignment the same way? Do we have to contextualize it within use? In this case, most of them are being used for school accountability purposes. Alignment's mentioned in several places in the standards. It's briefly mentioned, as Wayne noted, in the validity section. It's mentioned a little more so in standards 4.8 and 12.4. But it's not really any more specific than the peer review guidance. It lays out, approaches and cites some work on, breadth of representation and depth of knowledge, and et cetera, but should it be more specific in the standards? I know we're not amending the standards for another few years. Should alignment contractors be certified before allowing their results to be used as peer review evidence? Who would do the certifying if we did that? And here's going back to the formative. Do we even need, quote unquote, independent alignment results if more tests are being developed using principal design processes? So just like Saturday Night Live, discuss.
The only comments I'd make is I think Scott and I are pretty aligned in terms of this last issue, the independent stuff. I believe that there needs to be, before we certify anybody for alignment, I think we need to improve the methodology, and I think we need to begin with the claims, the claims related to the standards themselves. So I won't hop on that again, but I think if the standards are not, if there's not sufficient evidence and proof to show that the standards are aligned to the claims, then everything else falls apart, and that's where the biggest weakness is. I think the alignment methodologies are pretty varied, and I think we need some matrices, some numbers to be able to compare them. Now, two things I'll make that are controversial, probably not solution, but I'll throw them out there anyway. I don't believe, for reasons that Scott said, but I'm going to go further, I don't believe that assessment providers, contractors should be able to contract for alignment. That should be the responsibility of the test user, the state, the district, the national certifying organization, not the test vendor. Because let's think there are 10 vendors vying for a major contract. Let's say it's California comes open, or Texas comes open, or a large certification test, and there are 10 finalists. Do you not think one of those 10 vendors is going to try a little bit to get alignment results that are a little bit more leaning to them? And then if one vendor tries to just cook the books just a little bit, just give me 10 more points on that 100-point scale, please. Then the second vendor, who's honest, has to say, well, geez, we know what they're doing. We better get 12 more points. Then the third one has to get 14 more points. So I think it's corruptible, and it will be corrupted. And so my view is that, unfortunately, the state has to pay for it, not the vendor. Take it out of their hands, because quite frankly, if the vendor is in control of selecting who does it and is in charge of contracting and doing the meetings and setting up and reviewing the protocols and reviewing the criteria, if that's what the vendor's doing, there's too much temptation to subvert things. So I think take them out of there. And secondly, when you do bid a test, especially if it's an off-the-shelf test, you're often asked to do, as part of an RFP, you're asked to submit your own internal alignment, SAT, ACT, any kind of off-shelf, probably consortium tests as well. And the problem with states, they get these internal documents which make it sound like everything's perfect from the vendor in the RFP. So there has to be some culpability there too. So I'd also further suggest that if you're submitting an internal alignment for an RFP at a proposal, and you get the winning bid, and the independent alignment shows that you're off the charts by whatever metric we can use, you're liable to pay for the alignment results and the changes to the test. So if I'm going to go there and I'm going to tell you that I got 99% alignment in cognitive demand and in content and in range of and balance, and I'm off, not by a little bit, but by a lot, then I'm culpable and I have some financial damages there. So there has to be motivation for the internal groups to do a better job when they're doing the internal studies to be competitive, but then ultimately the decision and the verdict has to be done by an independent alignment paid by the state or the entity. And if they can't afford it, then it goes away, which I don't think would be too bad, quite frankly.
Ellen, do you want to offer some comments?
Sure, and I appreciate this. What this independent means. We go back to that conversation if you'd like. That's just one of the reasons that I believe that most of the information should be qualitative. So we provide a report back. We don't provide it in a way that people can be stacked up or compared. I would say that in many cases, a state will include in its contract with a vendor the requirement to hire an independent contractor to do an alignment study, and in those cases, when there's a solicitation to be that vendor, for example, to do the alignment study, we insist that all of our communications are directly with the client state. and not, we don't provide the reports to the vendor unless that goes through the client. So there are ways to work around some of the contractual requirements because some states have to do it that way. But
that's usually just a procurement thing.
Yeah, and it's really, really important that, as Wayne was saying, that the vendors don't. I will tell you the number one problem that we uncover with studies is a lack of communication or lack of clear understanding and agreement between a state and its vendor. They think they're talking about the same thing and they're not. And if a vendor comes with a bank of items and said, sure, they are absolutely aligned with your standards, I don't believe a word of that. And part of what we do is not just look at the items in relation to claims or standards, but in relation to what's in the metadata for the items. So what did the vendor think this was to be measuring? And we can go, you see right here, this is an area where the vendor believes that it's measuring what you want to have measured on your test, state people, but your interpretation of that claim or that area is very different. And so you want it to look very different on the assessment. So that's probably the biggest issue we ever uncover, is that there's what the vendor is saying is not what the state wants to have on its test. So that's what you have to look at. But unless you look at the actual metadata, what is in the code for the items, what the vendor believes or what item writers tell them it's measuring, you can't know that. So but the formative stuff, I would go back to the peer review idea, is that, we say certainly 3.1, but 2.1 is a lot about test development, and that's very much alignment. And so you have to address those issues. And what should happen is the state should submit an alignment evaluation report and ours I think everybody's comes with a bunch of recommendations for specific kinds of things. Like here, you might want to tighten up your test specifications in this particular area, or, you're clearly not aligned with what your vendor thinks is going on in its item bank. But along with that has to come with a plan and a timeline. So I'm a state, I get some stuff, I've got some gaps and weaknesses that are uncovered here, and I say, what can we do? Well, over the next 3 years, here are the kinds of things that we're going to do to improve the quality of alignment. So the package of the report and the plan and timeline for next steps is a must. If a state goes in and just puts its alignment report into the box, I doubt that'll work very well for them.
Yeah, and just lastly, we should probably move on to the next, to Susan's topic. But I do think that the reason why this is such a big deal for peer review, if there's any state folks on the line, they know that this caused them a lot of anxiety, between this and generally things like inclusion are the, do not pass go kind of criteria for peer review. And so there's other things you could finesse, like, now they actually finally care about validity a little bit, but for a lot of years it was simply alignment and inclusion. So it causes a lot of angst, and that's why it is important to think about cleaning this up in ways that the results are credible, the processes are credible, and actually useful for improving our tests. So I think we should probably move to Susan, given the time.
Yeah. No, thanks, Scott. And I was actually going to jump in there on your second topic because I think it relates to this. Your topic was about since reliability and validity are contextualized, so shouldn't the criteria or something to that effect? And I completely agree. So that leads into this, which is interpreting the results, which I think is probably one of the, all these are important challenges. So this is one of the ones that bubbled up to the top here. So if you can move to the next slide, Danos. Okay, so I actually stole Ellen's question. This was Ellen's second question that she had on one of her slides. As I was putting mine together, I might have been a little bit late. So I saw the question. I'm like, yes, that's what I'm talking about. She had highlighted, one of these things we should be thinking about is how well does the assessment as administered capture the intended content and performance expectations. And I thought that was really telling because, when we start to think, we've got a number of, I'll call them traditional metrics. They've been talked about some in this session, so I won't dive too deep into those, but they somewhat assume a particular structure, or they began by that. I know some folks in our field have evolved those, but really thinking about a particular structure and that tests were designed to cover each and every standard. And we've already addressed that as a challenge now to how we're looking, how standards are developed and things like that. And then they yielded empirical results that can be compared against some preset criteria. I think the challenges that we're seeing to using some of these traditional metrics to kind of answer that question that Ellen posed was that we definitely have new structures for defining that intended content and performance. And I highlighted the NGSS, but obviously there's others out there. It's not just about those standards. We talked about the sampling strategy. So thanks guys for setting up my topic. We talked about using different assessments for measuring student achievement. Wayne shared about kind of the ACT and SAT and looking at those. And then we also, I threw out there the call for shorter length tests. We know we've seen that, the criticism that we're testing too much. So how do we be more efficient with our testing, but then meet these alignment metrics that we're looking for so many items or so many measurement opportunities? And so I think with all of that, I think a lot of folks doing this work were saying, well, how do we follow these traditional models that were accepted by peer review, but meet the new, in the new faces of what this looked like? So if you can move to the next slide, Thanos. Okay, so this probably sounds now like nothing new because I think we've highlighted so many of these already in this session. I think this goes back to, again, what Scott was saying, is that should we have a contextualized approach to looking at this? And I agree. First, I think we should articulate the strategy for selecting and developing the specific test. And you can connect this to what Ellen was talking about with regards to claims. You could think about this as a contextualized approach, but say, for example, that a state decides to use a college readiness measure as their high school assessment. Well, that's changing course a little bit, and there's great reasons for doing so, but that, again, it looks very different than, say, if they had developed their own assessment for those standards. From that strategy, definitely identify the structures of inference. So this was what we were talking about earlier with regards to how are you going to report scores, claims, performance level descriptors, content domains, and think about those structures based on the intended interpretation of scores. And then from there, like, really define your expectations for alignment. This might be some of that communication that we were talking about between the state and their vendor of who's doing the study. Is what do we expect to see from alignment? Not just what kind of results do we want to have, but where do we expect to see alignment? Where do we need alignment to meet our intended claims, to support and have reliable inferences based on how we use scores? And that gets back to the structures. That gets back to the sampling of the content. If there's going to be a sampling, let's make sure we build that into our plan for interpreting the results. And really design a study around these expectations. Make sure that this is all, again, I'll use the word Scott highlighted, which was contextualized here. And then I always encourage groups to collect detailed alignment results, because we're data people, right? We'd like to have that detailed information. But that doesn't mean the alignment has to go to the alignment evaluation has to be done necessarily at the standard level or the substandard level or whatever else is defined down there. Again, the reporting and the evaluation and inferences can be done at a higher level. And then again, lastly, just interpreting those alignment results in light of the expectations from number 3 that you defined, and that overall strategy. So making sure that you're providing that evidence to support how a group plans to use the assessment and what they expected to see from alignment. And maybe, this thought means we need some new models, as we were just talking about, or we need to change the way we were thinking about this. Or again, going back to some of what my colleagues have said, it's really about asking new questions when it comes to alignment here. So I just ran through that pretty quickly. I'll let my colleagues jump in here with their thoughts.
Wayne, do you have any comments?
No, I think I'll pass on this one. I've said enough so far.
Ellen, would you like to offer any comments?
Sure. I wholeheartedly agree here. Susan, it's not really a big surprise. We've worked together over the years on these kinds of ideas, and so I think a lot of this is very consistent with what we think, that understanding what you're trying to do is support the interpretation and use of a test score. That's what this is about. It's part of a validity package, and that it's got to be tied to, I think, whatever framework you're using for test design and development should be the same framework you use for evaluating the quality of alignment. And I think we forget that we just alignment comes out of left field, and all of a sudden we have to do an alignment study. Oh no, it should be the same criteria we use when we design and develop. So I link this framework to each of the phases in a principal design assessment process. So that it makes perfect sense. Check out each phase and tweak the pieces that need to be tweaked as you get there. At the same time, realizing that this is all language, and language is going to be always a little bit loose. And I don't believe that's ever going to get so precise and so finite, and that you had 2 points higher on one alignment study than another. It makes no sense to me. So I'll leave it at that.
But I do think that, this is a nice bookend to where you started, although we have one more topic, so don't let anybody leave. As we move, and maybe this will help Wayne's ill feelings towards alignment, but as we move to more principled design approaches, and alignment and validity theoretically get baked in from the start, the kinds of things that Susan's laying out here are really in this ECD or other principled assessment design framework. It should help with some of the wishy-washiness we've seen with Alliance, because as you said, Ellen's showing her age, saying write it down as opposed to type it down, or text it. But it's, the idea that you actually document this stuff through the principled assessment design process makes it hard to go back and said, well, that was over there. We didn't really mean that for the alignment study. You're locking yourself in once you adopt a principled assessment design process, so it flows from that. So I do think, Ellen, I know you've been working on this a lot and have great graphics to prove it. But I do think we need to be writing more about this as a field to help sort of, as Wayne said, can't certify the aligners till we certify and have some clear methodological discussions and preferences. And look, we're not going to, people are still arguing about validity, for God's sake, right? Trust me, I know that all too well, and all sorts of things. So we're not gonna put it to bed, but at least I think we get better on having this principled approach to alignment as well.
Are there questions, comments from participants, the audience?
And I realized I didn't put one thing in here about alignment results, but that kind of gets back to our conversation, like where Wayne started, and then Scott, you picked up on about agreement. I didn't put anything in here about looking at agreement, but I do believe somehow capturing that is important. And we have relied on things like evaluation feedback, but let's face it, that's always the last thing we're asking folks to do before they get to run out the door after multiple days of this activity. So, again, I would say another place we need to be looking here is how do we evaluate agreement, both in non-consensus models and consensus models.
Right.
I'm not abandoning that yet, Wayne. And then how do we use that to interpret the results? I mean, we could say it's good or bad or somewhere in between, but then does that mean we do or don't trust the results?
So my whole big idea is that when I do a job analysis, I've got a pretty good idea that the criterion, the KSAs or the task statements reflect the job. And it's not because I've got empirical data, but it's because I've gone through 4 or 5 or 6 different workshops with different participants, often in different locations or in different perspectives. And they're all giving me feedback that gets to the central tendency. And if I've got disagreements, I put them to the side and I adjust them. With standards development, not so much alignment, but alignment follows. I have no independent evidence that those standards really reflect what you need to learn. So if you're telling me what skills you need to be a computer programmer at SAS, I can look at computer programmers at SAS, I can look at their supervisors, I can not only look at what they're saying and triangulate on common agreement here and compute common agreement, I can do it independently with different groups. And then I can actually get the performance data from those students, those incumbents, and say, well, the people who said this is really important and they have the skill, are they really performing at the top level? And we know what happens with items. Sometimes you get an item that more kids who score low on the test get it right than kids who score high, and you throw that item out. There's none of that going on with standards. And all I'm saying is we should hold standards at the same level that we hold the task analysis for a job. Collect the data, run it by several independent panels, and then make sure that you've got some data, collaborate data, that if this is the kind of, and again, what Ellen said is, here are the standards that apply, here's the performance standard that applies to advanced versus proficient versus basic, and you have some evidence that suggests that those wordings hold up. And so I think we can do this. I think we're at the beginning stages of alignment, and so my whole recommendation is that we look at it much more clearly, much more rigorously, and we don't. I'd love to see NCME worry a lot less about what the Department of Ed says and a lot more what the test standards say about validity and content validity, because then we'll improve the process. But if we focus on what the department says and what we can do to meet past peer review, we're gonna not only run the practice to the ground, we're not going to advance this area at all in 10 years from now.
And Wayne, I completely agree with you. And the standards and NCME will have the credibility to influence the peers, which in turn will influence the department. And you know, they're not, those things, those peer review guidance documents are not written, you know, they're not sent down from heaven. They're actually, I know people on this meeting today who've contributed to writing those documents. And so where are they going to look to? You know, many of them would hopefully look to the standards and other, you know, sort of authoritative documents out of NCME or peer review publications. So the more we could, you know, get those out there, it will actually work to influence the peer review. So Lori Wise, again, is saying job analysis of college readiness needs an external criterion for validation. Doesn't matter what the test measures as long as it predicts the criterion. Most K-12 assessments are used to indicate whether students have acquired specific knowledge and skills. Alignment's critical for validating that interpretation of scores, which is, I think, Wayne, is a critical point. And you know, you know, contrasting that with the examples you've been citing about job analysis or college readiness, wouldn't you agree?
No, I would, but I think we can still predict and measure specific skills as well as general skills. So college readiness is a general skill, but I think we can. I mean, we do it in personality, we do it in IO psychology, where we can. Algebra. So does a student possess this skill in algebra? Well, there might be another measure of that kind of skill, and we can see if the student possessed that, or if what their grades were. So there are ways of doing it. They're not perfect, but there are ways of improving it, because right now we're basing everything on a paper world, which is 10 folks got together in math, very well trained, I'm sure, very well qualified, and they agreed that this is important. And the problem is when we get the 10 faculty and the 10 11th grade teachers together, they have different conceptions of what you need to be college ready. So if they're all so wise and so experienced and so wonderful, how come they're coming up with different results about what college readiness is, or what proficient is, or what basic is? So I just think we need to find ways to get some corroborating evidence to back up the standard statements.
Well,
I'd agree with.
That's a whole different discussion. Go ahead, Elle.
I agree with you in that. I think we're coming up on the fourth year of a 4-year project that, you know, really it's in science, but it's looking at, in order for something to really be aligned, you really do have to go back to where the standards are driving instruction. And if you don't have a common understanding of the expectations, that the common expectation that drives both curriculum development and assessment development, these two things cannot be aligned. So we have to start with that core, and I think that's where we fail, is that we hire some company that gives us a test to go build a test, and there are zero conversations about what's actually happening in instruction in classrooms. So if the tests are supposed to reflect the quality of instruction or the nature of what kids have learned, whatever you're claiming your test is measuring, it really should have a much stronger tie with what's happening in classrooms and the interpretations of the standards that are applied in the curriculum and instructional materials the teachers use. So the fact that we don't have those links in most systems very tight is a problem throughout. So you might have a test that comes out with I don't know, perfect alignment. I've never seen one, but with the standards, and yet it is not telling you much about what's happening in classrooms, because that degree of alignment was never part of the game. So I think we've kind of failed. We've run ahead with these ideas about how we evaluate alignment, and forgetting that the whole point was the scores are supposed to be used, go through that sausage grinder of accountability to drive better decisions in education. We don't have a lot of evidence that actually happens very well, but That's the whole point of having these tests be aligned. It's part of a systemic reform model where you've got to have all these pieces aligned, and they just aren't. So I think the problem starts with the way we use our standards, we leverage them or don't in very good ways to build aligned systems that are driving instruction and driving assessment.
Mm-hmm.
Just to highlight a couple of things from the chat. One is that Lori Wise indicated to folks, alignment is not all or nothing. Qualitative feedback is formally useful, but you need some kind of scale to communicate degree of alignment. So that was just one comment from Lori. Another comment from Harry Charalambos is the need for standardization of training of SMEs, subject matter experts in standard setting. So that's certainly a valid point. There are also quantitative frameworks to evaluate standard certain results, and more folks are providing that. And Ellen's nice reply here is, so one measure could be 80% is alignment, but what does that mean? And certain percentages certainly need.
It's better than 80.
Yeah, not as good as 90.
Yeah.
And I think the way to improve practice, quite frankly, is I think we've thought of a lot of good examples here, but there's a lot to improve. And I think the quickest improvement will be made by recognizing, by some of the stuff that folks have said. One is if NCME and others come forth with some way of emphasizing that alignment is one methodology in a multi-method, multi-treatment kind of design that we need to evaluate test quality. And if an 83% test is going to make it over a 73% aligned test, if a test that's aligned 83% is better than a test that's 73%, and we're not looking at reliability, we're not looking at errors, we're not looking at the kind of items and the quality of items, the response processes, or the statistical data, then we have malpractice going on. And that's the world I think we live in right now, that if you don't have good alignment, states are forced to say to the vendor, well, you've got to take apart that test and we need a second essay. We need one open-ended math item that measures math communication. Now, we all know that's not going to do anything except maybe allow you to pass peer review. And so the best thing we can do is emphasize that alignment is not the messiah. That alignment is no better than many other indicators of test quality. It's worth retaining. I don't want to throw it out, but I also don't want to give it elevated weight above all the other factors that are just as important. And I think we have to evaluate test quality in terms of multi-factors with multi-methods.
All right, so we're going to move over to
said.
the next topic. Thank you all for enthusiastically chiming in here. But I do want to make just refer you to two items on the chat just for your reference. One is that Sarah Christopherson from YSEP has opened up herself to conversations around DOK. So the YSEP is the Wisconsin Center for Evaluation Products and Services, and they're welcome to, and she's welcome to talking about the issue of, or conversation around depth of knowledge. And then also there's a link on there that was provided for that this session will be offered recorded, so you can listen to us again as much as you like on the NCME's YouTube channel. So please find that link on the chat and get to it, and it'll be posted there as soon as this process resumes. So now we're going to move over to the next topic that Scott is going to offer some comments on. That's the changes to alignment due to COVID and what we're all faced with the situation happening now. So,
yeah, and thanks, Thanos. And it's not necessarily changes to alignment, but there is potential alignment concern, if you will. And this goes back to actually the beginning about, claims and things like that Ellen was talking about. But if you go to the next slide, there's only one slide in this section. So there's been several organizations, most notably Student Achievement Partners, TNTP, and is another one, have proposed having schools teach what they're calling prioritized standards in the 2020-2021 school year. And the reason for that is because to have given the sort of lost time, if you will, of the previous year and likely reduced length school year this year, that it's most important to focus on the things that are essential building blocks for continued development in that topic area. And just to give you an example, right, is oftentimes like 5th grade math, the key priority is developing knowledge and skills related to proportional reasoning. But they also have sprinklings of, introducing some aspects of things like geometry and data and statistics in there. And, we all love data and statistics here, but, you might argue that in 5th grade, things like geometry and data and statistics would play second fiddle to something as big of an idea as proportional reasoning to get you ready for pre-algebra. So they have a pretty nice document that lays this out. Now, here's, we always are concerned about research to practice. If states, school districts, teachers actually adopt this and teach fewer standards by following these guidelines, and many states are adopting these guidelines in their school reopening plans, and for sake of argument, let's say there's 10 standards in a grade content area, and the prioritized standards say teach 7 of those. What are the implications for our state tests in 2021? I've talked with several technical advisory committees about this, and we're all empiricists and don't like to give up trends very easily and want to see, well, if we just don't change the test, then we won't have as many equating issues, and we'll be able to document trends better than if we change the blueprint. But alignment is really about saying, if this is what you're telling teachers to teach and kids to learn, and then the test measures those or doesn't, is why we actually conduct alignment studies. So what are the implications for alignment studies in in next year if states are actually in that position? If you could imagine if we were in that position, should they be held accountable to the prioritized standards, even if the test includes all the standards, or how does that work? What do you guys think? This is just a late discussion item, but it's good. Many states and many of you on the call on the Zoom who are technical advisors for states are going to be facing this. So just throwing this out there for my colleagues to wrestle with.
Well, an idea I'll throw out there, because I haven't faced this yet in any of the places I've worked with, but I'm sure it's on the horizon, is to not change the test, because we don't want to change the test for the reasons you've already cited. It's sacrilege and it's for 1 year, so it's a lot of money and a lot of effort. So don't change the test, but don't do an alignment either, because states have enough to do next year and enough money and not enough money to spend. So let the State Department of Ed, some entity there or their vendor, tell us what they're emphasizing. And so the example you gave is a good one. If they're emphasizing 7 of the 10 standards, wonderful. We're going to administer the whole test, and I'd like to look at the scores on the whole test, but also the scores on a weighted 7 standard model. So I know there's no way to scale it. There's no way to compare the new test to the old without some kind of a concordance, and I'm not a big fan of that either. But I guess I'm just saying, we're in such unprecedented times. Let's not waste money in trying to be overly precise when we can't be. Do what you need to do, which is, if you want to prioritize 7 standards, go for it, do it. Tell us which ones they are, flag those items, try to compute a weighted score scale on those items. I don't know that we can compare it to past or future trends, but I guess I'd just leave it there. I'd just say, do all the things you said, but don't make a state have to jump through more hoops and do an alignment study for 1 year or change the test unless they want to.
Yeah, I was doing a hypothetical alignment. I don't think anybody's going to have to do one, but how would we view alignment in that way?
Well, same as I view it now.
I'm gonna reject the idea of prioritizing standards. I go back to the idea of your standards are not a checklist. There are bigger ideas, and I think if you get educators to determine what the big ideas are for the year, they will relate to the standards, but you're going to teach this standard and not that one. You shouldn't be teaching the standards in that way anyway. So I just reject that whole premise that I've never liked the idea of prioritized or you go through and you pick out, like you're weaving something, you pick out which ones you're going to weave under. And So what are the big ideas? So I think that's where we should start, is the premise. And changing the test. I think this is going to rock our world. I mean, I think we will probably not see for much longer what we've seen in the past, this big end of year test that's supposed to do all these things, which they've never done very well. So I think this is a tremendous opportunity. That I'm one of those people who tends to focus deeply on validity issues and what you're trying to get what are you trying to do with these tests? You're trying to leverage good decisions in every school and every classroom and state in terms of distribution of resources, find out where we need some help. That's a different thing. I'm not buying into using these for teacher evaluations or a lot of other purposes, but I have trouble with the kids that are going to be tested on things they have not had the opportunity to learn. I think that's an issue that we have to address here. So there's the desire for large scale data, but there's also what actually makes sense for kids. And the prioritizing idea, if we're prioritizing key big ideas, that we should have some way to capture how kids are learning. If we believe that's really important, then we really need to be able to focus in on that. And I do not think we can do it by just looking at parts of a test. So I think we should open ourselves to gathering other kinds of artifacts of student work, think more broadly in a richer way about what constitutes evidence to help us understand what's happening in schools.
I agree with what the other panelists have said of not changing the test. I think that would be a lot to ask of states and everyone this year, because there's just a lot other things to think about. I also agree that we, though, have a great research opportunity here. And again, we're a bunch of researchers probably here on the call that are thinking about, how do we measure this new concept of what's being termed learning loss? And how do we can we then use some of this data to evaluate the different models of adapting to this changing environment? We've got different models of remote learning, half in person, half at home, just all these different models that we're looking at now for the next school year, and that we even had last spring. So I do agree with what Ellen said and what Scott brought up of like what happens if you give kids a test on something they didn't really get to, but hoping there's some interconnectedness, we might be able to identify where, even if it wasn't a prioritized part of their curriculum, they maybe still were able to begin to develop their skills in these areas. So I would hope that we could really use this to learn and prepare for if we are ever again in this situation, and just know how to best respond to meet the needs of kids and continue their learning.
Well, let's get out of the situation first. It'd be nice.
Yeah.
But so Ellen, you got these smart folks like Mark Johnson and Chad Buckendahl agreeing with you, so that's a good start. But I do think that I think there's a messaging issue here, though, because we continually say I'm unlike Wayne, I'm not going to completely throw standards-based education under the bus and say, part of the promise is you teach these standards, we're going to test your kids on these standards. And that's what alignment was meant to do early on. And now we're saying, teach your kids these standards, but we're going to test them on all those. I just think we need to be, we think as an assessment community, we need to message this very carefully.
And some of the things that I've heard you guys say in the last question, I really agree on. I'd like to see us emphasize them more. So, for example, I've heard both Ellen and Scott really push on the fact that the summative testing model that we have now is not working.
Yeah. And
I'm not going to argue that a formative model or a through-cost assessment is going to be tremendously better and solve everything. But I think we all agree that it'll be a lot better. It may not solve everything, but it will, for the intended purposes of what we have accountability testing for now, doing it in real time with a through-cost design or a series of formative evidence-based tasks would be an improvement and would really help guide learning and curriculum. And so with a pandemic like this, maybe this is an opportunity to really push that thought and to really showcase some of the limitations of what we have here, because we've all pushed those ideas, whether it was at PAC or with states, and they fall through the wayside because of practicality, because of operational issues, because we can't get kids to the devices, or it's going to take up too much testing time. And I think we got to push back on that, because we've fallen into accepting a model that we know doesn't work, isn't getting us where we need to go. And this is an opportunity to really change it. And I also like what Susan said about the opportunity to learn, and also the assessment. We've got to really look harder at what we have right now, and I think we need to push forth radical changes when we have the opportunity, because this is the time to do it.
Yeah, well said.
So a lot of the conversations, the comments that you all are offering seem to be echoed by many of the comments that you all are referring to. And trying to align the alignment with the standards is going to be a real challenge, and trying to take a opportunity to learn from it and also provide more radical or transformative approaches seems to be an agreed upon solution or effort to undertake. Now we've come to the close. We have a minute left for any closing 10-second snippet of comments that you all want to offer.
I'd like to thank Susan for putting this together. Really appreciate, I always appreciate Susan's work, but it was, I think, a great topic, and there's a lot of things that we can see moving forward for this. And as Sarah in the chat had said, there's, I certainly would be open to having further conversations that really push on some of these issues.
Yeah, I agree. And we need to continue to try to push the peer review process because that's what states face. And so if we have a little more agreement on this stuff, then we have a chance of pushing that. And it's great to see Lori Wise back in action there. Look at that.
Yes. You're here. Okay,
I agree. I think we started talking about this all like from a methodological perspective and very specific, and it evolved through our conversations and then the conversation today to highlighting where we are really looking for the important aspects of this to be echoed in the standards and then in peer review guidance. So interesting to see where this has led to. So thanks everybody for participating.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Thank you guys.
Excellent work. Please, before you leave the chat area or sign off, fill out the survey giving us some feedback about the session. And thank you all. And Wayne, you have somebody reaching out to you for some thoughts on guiding the selection and design of the formative tasks. So just bring it to your attention. But thank you, everybody. Wishing you all the best. Thanks again for your participation.
Thanks, Thanos.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Session is done.